we'll wait. We'll just see if other people join while the lesson on goes. So, but we have a long lesson today, so for now, we just need to get started. So I will start presenting, and if anyone has any questions, just feel free to ask because this is definitely a more complicated lesson. Oh, wait, shit. Alrighty, cool. So Code Unity Lesson 6. Today we'll be talking about arrays and vectors. So these are very important, these are very important aspects of programming, especially in C++. So I would highly recommend you pay attention to this lesson and take notes, ask questions, do the practice problems, whatever you need to do. All right, so first we're going to start off with arrays. Okay, so what are arrays? Arrays in C++ are a fundamental data structure that allow you to store multiple items of the same type together. Basically, this makes it so that you can have multiple integers or multiple strings or multiple characters or whatever you'd like in the same type of variable. So that might not make sense right now, but you'll see an example of it and it'll make a bit more sense. So first we'll talk about how do you declare an array. So declaring an array you declare an array by specifying the type of its elements, followed by the array name and the size of the array in brackets. So here we have an int. So this is like the type of the elements in the array. So the array will house integers. And then the name of the array is just my array. And then the size is 10. So like I said in the comment here, this is basically just an array of 10 integers. So then we have initializing arrays. So array initialization allows you to assign values to the items in the array. Here are a few examples of different ways to initialize an array. So you can initialize an array here with 5 different integers. So here I have int my array of 5 equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this basically assigns all 5 values of the array to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then here we just do in my array 5 equals 1 and 2. So this doesn't assign all 5, but what this will do is it'll take the first 2 elements and it'll assign 1 and 2 to them, but the rest will just be 0. And then finally, we got in my array, but we don't specify the size. We're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So because we've assigned 5 integers to it, it automatically determines the size of the array to be 5. Just know that with arrays, it needs to have a specific size. That's like the main point of arrays and the main difference between arrays and vectors, which we'll get into later. So now that we've done that, there's going to be a lot of practice for you guys to do during today's lesson. So I'll give you maybe 3 minutes to do this one. Just create an array of 5 integers, 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. And yeah, I'll give you 3 minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, because there will be a lot of practice problems during this lesson. And if you don't understand the stuff we're doing now, it'll get more and more confusing as we continue. So please, actually, if you have any questions, ask. All right. I think I've given you guys a few minutes. If you have like done this and you wanted to do this, like did anyone have any questions or do you guys want more time for this or like are you good? All right, I'm gonna assume that means you're good. In any case, I'm gonna just continue on. All right, here are the answers to the questions. So, one, you can just set up an array like this into my array of size 5 equals 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Or you technically don't have to like state the size of the array and you can just list the like what the items in the array should be. Personally, I prefer just stating the size of the array because it keeps it simpler and more readable. So that's why I just prefer this option. All right, continuing on, we have accessing array elements. So array elements are always accessed with the subscript operator and then like with the subscript operator like square brackets. And the index must always start from 0. This is very important. If you only remember one thing about arrays and it make sure it's this. Like honestly, this is so important. With the index starting from 0. The index of the array always starts from 0. So here we could have in my array 10 equals like so an array of 10 integers with the integers being 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then we say my array of 0 equals 10. That means the first element of the array is 10. So here the first element is 0, but we change the 0 to a 10 because we're saying that that is the first element. Here we say int value, so we're making a new integer equals my array 2. So that changes the third element, which is that makes this integer of value equal to the third element of this array, which is the value 2. So yeah, that is essentially what is happening here. So now that we've gone over that, I'm going to give you another practice problem. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of practice problems in today's lesson. I want you to make an array of 5 characters, A, B, C, D, and E. And I want you to print out the third item in this list. Hint, always remember that all array indexes start at 0. So yeah, I'll give you about 3 minutes to do that one. All right, well, I've given you guys a couple minutes to work on this. I'm sure that like if you wanted to do it, you've done it. And if you had any problems, like feel free to ask, but if not, I will just move on. Okay, if no one had any questions on that, here is the answer for that. So here we set the um like the variable type of the items in the array to character. We just name it my array and we set the size to 5. And then we state that the characters are 1 A, B, C, D, and E, like it said here. And then it wanted us to print out the third item in the array. So here we print out my array 2. That's because, remember, this would be my array 0, this would be my array 1, this would be my array 2, because the array always starts from 0. So in reality, it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in a 5 array, in a five item array. That's how the iterators would be listed. So my array 2 would be the third item. All right. Here's another practice problem that I want you to try. And it says here, take your array of characters from this question and change the second item in the array to T and then print that out. Hint, remember all array indexes start from 0. This one is slightly trickier, and the practice problems will get trickier as we continue on. So if you have a problem with this, just don't stress it, but I still want you to give it a try. All right, I've given a few minutes for this problem as well. So I will just show you the answer and then we'll move on. So here we have the answer. We set up a character of arrays like we did last time. And to change the array value, which we do is, it wants us here to change this second item in the array to T. So what we do is we go my array 1, which is this item, which is B currently, and we say it equals T. So that way it changes the second item in the array as listed by this 1 here from B to T. And then we just output myArray1 and it would output to T. All right, anyways, we shall continue on. Passing arrays into functions. So when passing an array into a function, you state the array and its type as a function parameter. When calling the function in your main program, you state the name of the array you would like to pass in. When using the array in the function, you use the name you've given in the parameters. So here we have a good example of that. We state an array. Int myArray5 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, whatever, right? And then we do void array pass int array. All this does basically is it takes in an array. And normally we'd say array pass and then in brackets my array to state that that is the array you're passing in. But here we just haven't done that yet. But basically what I'm trying to show here, the main thing, is that the array that you use and you manipulate in your function is this array name. Because we've just named it int arr for array. But here we have it named my array. So even though if we pass this in the function, we'd be manipulating this variable name, this array name, because that's how functions work. You manipulate the parameter names, not the name of the variable you're passing in. So that's essentially what I wanted to show you here. Anyways, continuing on, I want you to do another one here. Create a program. Write a program that creates a function. This is like, okay, before I say this is like probably the one of, if not the hardest practice problem in this lesson. So if you don't get it immediately or at all, that's okay. But I will show you the answer in a few minutes. But anyways, in this, I want you to write a program that creates a function, passes an array and the array size into the function, and then prints every time in the array, and then prints every item in the array in a new line. So as a hint in your function, use a for loop or a while loop to move through each array index. Like I said, this question's a little trickier, so I will give you 5 minutes to work on it. And if you don't get it, honestly, don't stress it, because I'll show you the answer in the next slide and I'll explain everything. So just give it a try, though. I would highly recommend that. All right, I've given about 5 minutes for you guys to try this problem. If you've joined late, don't worry about it. You can always just watch the video over to look at the previous practice problems we've done. But here I've given you guys 5 minutes to try this practice problem. So if you've tried it, great. If not, that's okay too. I mean, I would highly recommend it, but that's okay. Here's the answer for it on the next slide. I'll make sure to explain everything. So here we just essentially initialize our first array of 5 integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as we've done multiple times before. And then we pass that into array print with myArray and 5. And the 5 is essentially just the size of the array. Because here in our parameters, we set up our initial array and we need the size of the array. So like I said, whenever we're in the function, we always use the parameter names to do anything, honestly. So what we do here, we set up a for loop. Do for int I equals 0, I is less than size, and I plus plus. So this will loop over 5 times, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Sorry, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is why, like we explained in our for loop class, why we start at 0. This is why. We start 0 because for many array applications, arrays always start at iterator 0, at item 0, at like number 0. So we need to use zeros here. That is why for loops typically always start at the number 0. So here what we do is we see out array I. So what that will do is it'll go through each item in the array which we pass through, which is my array, and it'll just print out that item. So here it'll do array 0, but here this array is actually this array because we passed it in. So it'll just go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And after each one of these, it would end the line. So it goes 1, next line 2, next line 3, next line 4, next line 5. And we always have it less than size because think about this. If it only goes up to 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we say it's less than 5, which is the size, it'll never hit 5 as like you never need 5 because it only goes up to 4 in the iterators. However, 5 is the size of the array because that's how many items there are. So you can always have it be less than the size of the array when it's looping through and it when it loops through and takes that iterator in the array. So like I said, this is definitely a harder question. So do not be discouraged if you cannot figure it out, but here is the answer for it. If that didn't make any sense, I apologize. Please go watch the video over, but this is definitely a harder concept. I'd highly recommend you try out these practice problems and you ask questions if you have it. Anyways, I will continue to move on. This is more of a bonus thing. You don't really need to know this, but you can also apply this array logic for string manipulation. We don't really teach much about string manipulation in this class because it is a bit more of an advanced concept, but essentially string manipulation works in the same logic with C++ because a string in C++ is essentially just an array of characters. So what you can do is you can say string str hello. So this is your string hello, and then you can just see out string 0, and that'll just print H because that's your first character. And like, so essentially it's the same thing. It would be item 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And item 0 is the character H in the string hello. So that's like another interesting way that like arrays, the same kind of concept is used in C++. Anyways, now we will move on. Okay, right, sorry. Here, let's talk about some key point of arrays just to summarize. So arrays essentially store multiple elements of the same type in one variable. Array indexes always start at 0. The size of the array must be known at compile time, and arrays can be passed to functions typically with the separate size parameter. Understanding arrays is crucial for effective C++ programming, especially for performance critical applications. So these are some points that I would highly recommend memorizing. If you would like, you can screenshot this. Again, the video will be coming out after the class, so you can always just look at that. But if there's anything you want to memorize, it's definitely the information on this slide because this essentially summarizes all the key points you need to know about arrays before you start using them. So yeah, if you haven't screenshotted yet, I'll give you like a few seconds to do so, but then we'll move on. Alrighty, hopefully you have screenshotted that, but we shall move on. All right, vectors. So the main limitation of arrays in C++ is that their size must be known, and it can't change after you've set the size or the size has been set automatically. So in order to overcome this, we use something called dynamic memory allocation. That is just a fancy way of saying we're going to use this thing called vectors. So what are vectors? So vectors in C++ are part of the standard template library. Whatever, fine. Basically, they're more of a flexible alternative to arrays. So yeah, like I said, they're basically dynamic arrays. Being dynamic means that their size can change later on. Basically, it allows us to add or remove items in the array. It's basically just an array whose size is not strictly defined. Items can be added and items can be removed whenever you want in your program. So it essentially allows for so much more functionality and capabilities in C++ over arrays. So like I wrote here in a small item in the bottom, in my opinion, arrays are basically useless because vectors are just better. They can do everything arrays can do, but they also have the added like ability to like add or remove items wherever and whenever needed in your program. So that's essentially why I believe vectors are just a superior like method as opposed to arrays. Anyway, so here we can declare or initialize vectors. So in order to use vectors like at all, you need to hash include vector at the top of your program. Like at the top where we hash include IOStream, you need to add hash include vector. So that's essentially because vectors aren't really like an inherent part of the C++ standard library. So we just need to include this in order to get vector functionality. But that's like pretty simple. So as long as you write that at the top of your program, you're good. So you would declare a vector by specifying the type of its elements, just like arrays, and no need to include the size because it doesn't matter. You don't need to include this std dot dot if you're using namespace std at the top of your program, but here I guess I just didn't, so I had to write it. But I'll show you an example later where you don't really need to do that. But what you do is you say vector, and then in pointy brackets here, I guess you'd call them, you state your type of elements. So here we state integer, like we did for the array. Instead of putting it in the front, we write vector and then int the variable type name, and then we do the name of your vector. So this would just be a vector of integers essentially. And like I said, at no point do we ever specify the size because it just don't matter. It can be whatever you want it to be. So you can also initialize a vector at the time of declaration, which is similar to the declaration of an array. So this is essentially how we were initializing and declaring arrays before. So you say vector int my vector, just like I said before, and then you just say equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this initializes it with 5 elements, but this is not a strict 5 elements whatsoever. You can add as many elements as you want. You can remove all the elements if you want. You can remove like 3 elements. You can remove 2. You can add 1. You can add 4. It honestly doesn't matter what you do to this when it comes to adding or removing. But the one thing that is strict, like with arrays, is the variable type. All the items in this array must be integers. All the items in arrays and vectors, if you state that it's an integer here, it must be integers. If you say it's a double here, they must be doubles. If you state that they're characters here, they must be characters. If you state that they're strings here, they must be strings. So basically, that's the only strict operator in this entire like function. The only thing that's really strict when it comes to vectors is the fact that it has to be all integers for this example. But basically, the fact that you can increase or decrease the size is so important and so vital to C++ programming and higher level programming once you get into it. So just that's why I love vectors personally. All right, so adding or removing elements. So vectors provide various methods to add or remove elements. I would highly recommend screenshotting this because I'm gonna be honest, I don't even have all this memorized. So I'll give you a second to screenshot this, and then I'm just gonna explain what each thing does. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to screenshot that. If not, I'll be talking about this for a minute, so you'll have a chance to screenshot it in the next like minute or two. But anyways, so first we talk about adding elements. So for adding elements, you use the push back function. Essentially, you take your vector name, which in this case is my vector. I've done that multiple times, my vector, and you do dot push underscore back, and then the item you want to push back. So let's say you had a vector of five integers, like we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we do vector dot push underscore back 6. This essentially adds a 6 at the end of the vector. So now your vector, instead of being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. Anyways, then we have removing elements. So my vector dot pop back removes the last element of the vector. So if you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you did my vector dot pop back, it would just delete the 6 and just go back to being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think those two are pretty simple. Here we have inserting elements at a specific position. So my vector dot insert, and then dot insert is essentially how we insert it. That's the function we use. And then do my vector dot begin plus 2 and then 10. So if you do my vector dot begin, that my vector dot begin is the first item in your vector. Now that might not make much sense, and I can concede to the fact that that's a little complex. However, if as long as you remember that my vector dot begin is always the first item in the vector, you should be good. And then if you do plus 2, then that goes, if you were to do my vector dot begin plus 1, that'll be the second item. If you do my vector dot begin plus 2, that's the third item, and so on and so on. So basically, here we say we insert a 10 at the third position because this is the position 3, and then you do a 10 here when that's the item you want to insert. Then you could do my vector dot erase, which removes elements from a specific position. So my vector dot erase, and then you do my vector dot begin. Remember, that's the first item plus 1. So then, therefore, it'll just remove the second item. You don't have to specify any like other integers or variables or whatever because it's not really doing anything with it. Here, it needed to know what like the item it's inserting is, but here it's just removing an item, so you don't really have to worry about all that. Anyways, so these are very, very, very important. If you haven't screenshotted this yet, or if you haven't memorized this yet, or whatever, I would highly recommend doing so. But nevertheless, we shall continue on. All right, now accessing elements in a vector. So you can access elements using the subscript operator, like the square brackets, just like with arrays, or you can use the at method. So the at method, honestly, I don't really use that much. It more has higher capabilities in Java because Java is a bit more of a specified programming language. However, in C++, you can just use the square brackets, which I just personally use. But I've shown you both examples here. So the first element of your vector, you can just do int first element, whatever you want to name this, honestly. I just named it first element. And then you do my vector 0. As you know, with arrays, the iteration always starts at 0. It's the same deal with vectors. If I haven't already said that, vectors always start at 0. In this case, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, just like with arrays. But nevertheless, here you can just say my vector 0, and that'll access the first item in the vector. You can also use the dot at method with vectors, and you can say int second element, or whatever you want to name it, equals my vector dot at 1. And this would be accessing the second element. Like I said, I personally don't even use this because you just use this for arrays and vectors, so it just keeps it simpler to remember. So in my opinion, for this type of like to access the second element, I would honestly do my vector and then in square brackets 1. That I feel like would be pretty simple. But if you would prefer to use this by any reason, if it's simpler or easier to understand, go right on ahead. There's no problem with that. It works just as well. But like I said, in my opinion, this works with arrays, this works with vectors, it's less typing even. So I just prefer to use this. But anyways, continuing on, you can also check your size with the vector. So sometimes you don't know exactly what the size of your vector is if it's like really big and like you've put in a bunch of different items in there and you've done a bunch of stuff with it and you just haven't like kept track of what the exact size of your vector is, or if like it might be different depending on user input, or there's a lot of different scenarios in which the specific size of your vector might not be known. And that's the beauty of vectors, because you don't need to know the size of your vector to get the size of your vector for your program. If you ever need it for like for loops or while loops, to see how many times you got to loop it to sift through the items, then you can just immediately get that value by doing myVector.size. This will give you as an integer how many items are in your vector. So here I just wrote in size equals myVector.size, and that essentially will give whatever like the size. Let's say the vector is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as we've done before. This will just give me an integer value of 5. So that keeps it nice and simple. And yeah, this is a very important operator. I've used this countless times in my programming like career. So I would highly recommend you know this function as well. I would even recommend screenshotting it if you haven't already. But in any case, I will just continue on because we do have a practice problem for you. This practice problem, while it may look long and scary, is just because I've specified a lot of things that I want you to do in like very specific ways. So it's not actually as bad as you might think, but it does incorporate everything I've taught you about vectors so far. So I'm going to read through it, and I would highly recommend trying this out. If you like, if you can't figure it out, honestly, don't stress it. In a few minutes, I will show you the answer to this problem. Nevertheless, let me just read this out. So what I would like you to do is I want you to create a vector. I don't know why I said vector of integers. I want you to create a vector of doubles with 5 doubles here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and then 1.5. I then want you to add another element at the end of the vector, which is going to be 1.6. That's what I want you to add at the end of the vector. Then I want you to remove the first element of the vector. So I want you to remove this element, basically the 1.1. And then finally, I want you to print this out. And every element of the vector should be on its own line. So it should be the first element, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth, or then the sixth, or however many there are. You must incorporate the size function if the size of the vectors, I don't know why I wrote array, the size of the vector is required. And it will be if you figure out what you need to do with this program. Anyways, as a hint, I would say always print out arrays and vectors with a for loop or a while loop, as we had done before. This is how you have to print out arrays and vectors. Unfortunately, you can't just say see out your vector. That won't work because you need to see out each item individually. So that's why you need to use a for loop to sift through each item and print them all out individually. Anyways, I'm going to give you about 4 minutes to do this, and then I'll show you the answer, and then we'll probably have to wrap up the class. So good luck with this. If you can't figure it out, honestly, don't stress it, but I'd highly recommend still giving it a try. Alrighty, I've given you guys a few minutes to try this out. If you haven't figured it out, that's okay. I'll show you the answer on the next slide, and I'll make sure to explain it all. So here we initialize our first, like our vector, and we state that the type has to be a double. So we state that, and then here we state the five doubles that I wanted it to be: 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5. Then we add 1.6 to the end of the vector by using the push back function. So we do my vector dot push back 1.6. And then we wanted to erase the first item of the vector. Remember, the first item of your vector is always my vector dot begin. So you do my vector dot erase, and then in brackets my vector dot begin. So this essentially is the first item of your vector. So you do my vector dot erase, my vector dot begin, and it'll erase the 1.1. And then in order to print it, we need to use the size function in order to get the size. Remember, like I said for arrays, if the size of this vector is 5, the array items, or the array or vector items, honestly, will be 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all less than 5. So as long as you start this at 0 and say it's less than 5, it'll iterate as 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. And that will essentially allow you to iterate through all the items in your array. So as a helpful tip, you should always, and when it comes to vectors and arrays, if you need to go through every item in a vector or array, just state that I should be less than your vector size or your array size. That'll always allow you to sift through each item in the vector or array. That is a very helpful tip. I think I've used that multiple times. So as long as you remember that, I guarantee you will be good. But anyways, then we do cout my vector I to print each item from the vector, and then we type end L just to make a new line. So that essentially prints each item in a new line. And this is how you solve that question. Anyways, just to wrap it up, we're going to talk about some key points about vectors. So vectors are dynamic arrays that can change size. They're part of the standard template library. You don't really need to know this, I'm going to be honest. But the rest of them are important. So vectors are dynamic arrays that can change size. Vectors provide methods to add, remove, and access specific elements. That is like so important. Both of these are very important. And vectors can manage their own memory and grow as needed, which is basically the same thing as the first one. The main thing you really should remember about vectors is that they're dynamic, which means they can change size, and they have methods to add, remove, and access elements. So vectors in C++ are powerful and versatile, offering a wide range of functionalities that make them suitable for various applications where dynamic arrays are needed, which in my opinion, you have no reason to really use set arrays ever, unless somehow storage becomes a problem for you, which will only be a problem like in much more advanced programming. So just keep in mind that, at least in my opinion, vectors can have all the same functionality as arrays. And on top of that, they can add, remove items, and change size. So honestly, just in my opinion, just don't use arrays. Just always use vectors. But if you want to use arrays, that's fine too. There's literally nothing wrong with that. Anyways, any questions? So we are done now. I will stop presenting. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. If not, you're free to go.